Right. It seems very live. So, all right. So let me actually show what we have on the screen because that would probably be helpful instead of just showing the camera. Alrighty. So in this design review, we want to look at the proposal for OS version information. So there are a few proposed APIs that will allow us to do the checks which operating system you're running on, like Linux, OS X, Windows, and whatever else we add in the future, as well as being able to also tell the version itself. Now, historically, version checks are super problematic. Probably a bunch of people already know that, but Windows is doing what they call the version live, which means you call a Windows API, you ask for the version number, and they give you a version number that is different from what you're actually running on in some cases, because they know that many apps actually don't handle it correctly. So they changed the versioning scheme in Windows also quite a bit. I think in 8.1 they actually added a new set of APIs to make that a bit more robust, where you can actually ask for the version, but instead you can basically send a query and then it will tell you whether you are on that operating system or a later one, as opposed to just giving the version number out directly. So in this meeting, we'll talk a bit about the APIs that were proposed and what we think about them. If you're joining us live, please ask questions. They will show up here, and unless I'm screwing up, I should be able to take your questions and answer them during the meeting. Otherwise, just relax, enjoy, and enjoy the fighting over the APIs. All right, do you want to give us a walkthrough on the APIs themselves?
Yeah, sure.
Let me actually switch to the proposal. And I guess I should increase the font size on that one. Like a lot. So what does the diff represent? I guess it's the difference between what we proposed originally and then what you add.
So initially we had a struct representation for OS name, and from the comments from the community, I thought that enums made more sense, because even if it is a struct, and even if we have to have a new OS name like FreeBSD or something, then again you have to increase the version of the struct, which is same as increasing the version of the enum. So I didn't find a strong argument to not have enums, and having enums is more user friendly because you don't have to meddle with how to use the struct, whether to create a new object. With enums, you just click dot and IntelliSense helps you with finding the right value. And then based on feedback from Justin here, he was saying like was a lot of other frameworks like Java and other languages, they already use names like OS types and OS platforms. So going with previous naming, I just changed the names a bit around.
So this is intended to be flags, you know? Just looking at the values? I don't see that.
I don't know why it didn't show up here, but it has flags.
Oh, okay.
So originally, long time ago, we had the ability to just compare OS name to strings or create an OS name out of string. When did it disappear? Because I agree that without this, having a struct, I thought that the idea behind having the struct was that you can just pass a string and create one of those without us changing anything. The moment we remove this constructor, we still have it.
Well, to be fair, and Enum is open-ended, really, in the type system. Like,
yes.
No, I mean, honestly, like, if there is some, like, even the strings would have had to be reserved by some sort of convention. Like, we would have had to discuss publicly and say, okay, the future string for this shall be this, means that we also could use the same sort of central authority to say that the value 8 is now forever, given to this platform, and then one could define constants just like you could do the string. So maybe I think that was the.
I mean, why is it flags? Is it just flags so I can do is OS platform Linux or OS X as opposed to is OS platform Linux or is OS platform OS X?
Yeah.
Is that what it is? So we expect these to always be mutually exclusive? Because I thought it was more like we might eventually have bits to indicate more specificity. So I imagine the query, just reading this, I imagine the query being, is it all of these flags? Because, you know, I have something that says is something and it passes some flags. I expect it to be sort of telling me, yes, those flags are there, not is any of the following set. Because I thought there was some discussion on the thread that I saw that had to do with like flavors of these operating systems. Would there ever be? I think having mutually exclusive flags by design is kind of not a good idea if we intend them to stay that way.
Anyway, the only thing that I was saying is that I thought that the original idea behind the struct was that we kind of don't have to extend it, and then you said that we kind of will have to if we change the OS.
So the idea behind the struct was that you could have this escape valve where the implementation could be updated, but you didn't have, because previously we had this well-known list of names that public static freedom
exactly.
So we could update those slower than we updated the code in the EaseOS platform.
Correct. And I would say that still, I feel like what Nick said, that you can do it with an enum, but with enum it doesn't feel natural to do it. It feels like a hack versus having a constructor that takes a string and then some helper static method that just give you the pre-cooked values. Doesn't feel as much of a hack. Not that I
actually agree with that.
So I mean, one other argument that I heard with the OS name thing was also like if you look at NuGet, for example, they have a very similar problem where the lib folder names are essentially tied to platforms. And so at some point the question was if somebody else like Xamarin comes in and wants to add support for certain things, either in PCL or in NuGet, how would that be coordinated? Now, the nice thing with normal strings is that, well, I mean, unless somebody else calls their platform Xamarin, like it never really collides. Right. With an enum, the problem is if two people add a new enum, they may have both the value 5, but represent something completely differently. But with strings, like you're less likely to have collisions. Now, one could argue, and that's the thing that I think makes more sense moving forward, if this is an open source API, if somebody says, I support this thing, I mean, the question just came up here, what happens with, actually, how do I do this here in this tool? I think I can say this one. So somebody asked and said, we now support FreeBSD, like shouldn't we add that? Like I think what would happen is even if we don't add support for it in our repo, but somebody else added support for FreeBSD, they can immediately submit a pull request and basically claim the string, so at least people are unblocked. And so I think that bottleneck of like, many people adding the same entry essentially goes away by just choosing basically a PR-based model.
So that's one of the reasons why we want to have it as a separate library too, as opposed to putting in the core library, which is tied to the full framework and stuff.
I mean, it still begs the question, right? I mean, the nice thing with the string-based approach is that I don't even have to change the library, right? I can just literally call the constructor, pass in a random string. The other one still requires me to rebuild the library with the new enum. So like it makes it a bit more complicated. But I mean, we're not adding platforms like on a daily basis, right? So it's also not the most.
So it really depends if you're using this to exchange the information for other purposes than to call, ISOS platform. Because at the end of the day, there's going to be, sort of, presumably, I guess someone can implement. I guess the idea is someone implements a new platform, and then they have their own implementation of runtime information to respond to their new values. As I was thinking of it, I kind of saw the extensibility point because I was thinking, well, ultimately this thing is central, but I suppose it isn't if you're porting to your own platform.
Well, no, but the thing is that the existing platforms would return false for the new string because, well, the new string is new for a reason. The platform just got support.
They'll do the same thing for the enums too, right? Return false.
Assuming somebody has
except you have to.
Except
you have to change you have to either use the trick that you mentioned with the enum, which is kind of ugly, or you have to update the contract. So to me, it's not about changing the implementation libraries. It's like you have to update the contract to be able to access the new enum value. Submitting a PR and accepting PR, that's not a big deal. But then if you actually want to use it, you need to update the libraries that use it to new contracts.
That's true of those static fields too. Like
yeah, but you don't have to use the static fields. You can just basically instantiate OS name, pass the string that is your new platform, and existing platforms will say false.
So in Enum,
that's true for the integers too.
A number and cast it to the Enum type.
Yeah. I said you can do it, except the trick is kind of hacky, I would say.
Yeah.
But maybe it's okay. I'm not saying which one we should choose or not. But it feels a bit more like a hack versus new OS name, FreeBSD.
I mean, the question is, let's say somebody else ports this thing to some platform that we don't happen to care about, and then submits a PR to add that entry either to the enum or to the struct. Will we reject their PR? Most likely not. No. And so from that point of view, the barrier of entry is super low. And I would actually encourage people to add to that if they support new platforms.
We only get 32
I don't.
platforms here, right? With this design?
Sorry?
We get 32 platforms with this design. Is that if you're just going to start taking PRs for everybody's favorite platform?
Yeah, and we have to be careful about just letting people just put any platform in
So
there.
There was
questions
also,
the flags thing, but-
for the BSD thing, there was this discussion that's still ongoing about if we add BSD here, like, do we add BSD or do we add FreeBSD and OpenBSD and NetBSD, or like, how does that work out? So like the flags, if we go with an Enum thing, the flags thing makes me really nervous because like I see that we're eating up a bunch of space. We may, end up eating.
Yeah, if you do that, you sort of have to like split it almost, like have like the flavor type thing where you can have, I don't know, like a Unix flavor or like a BSD flavor versus a specific,
Right. But you can imagine that. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying, but yeah, you can imagine that like there's some Linux API. Like first you check if it's Linux, or first you check if it's BSD, and then there's some like BSD info or something that like knows about the specificity. But that's starting to get sort of complicated as well. But I mean, at the same time, it's hard to imagine some sort of centralized way to sort of sort of keep track of all the various.
So one thing that Justin had proposed as well, I think in a thread, in a comment, was if we kept the struct, getting rid of because the idea with the struct was we wanted to push people not towards the constructor, which was like the safety valve, this thing you want isn't there, but push people towards the static properties. So it was hiding the constructor and having a factory method so that people who typed new whatever, that didn't work, and then they would think, oh, maybe I can try to do OS name dot and then find some factory method. Oh, now I see Linux, Windows, whatever, and they're kind of on the happy path. So if the concern is about like just the pushing people to the discoverability of the static members, which you kind of get for free with an Enum, that might be a strategy.
If we're doing the Enum, do we really want to do flags? I mean, because
I don't think we do.
We do the struct. It's not like a flags type thing.
So to me, the value in doing flags, if we do an Enum, is that I type a little bit less when I want to ask the question, am I running on Linux or OS X? And I think that I think it's too high a price to pay.
Yeah, I agree. We could do a params array for this in the future. If people want to do it very often, you could just do params array of multiple of these.
I mean, the question is also like, what do we do for operating systems that release quite frequently? I mean, somebody just mentioned that Mac is shipping like crazy, so maybe you need to have that version information somehow. I mean, do we care? Do we not care? How will we do that? Because this one only allows you to after they're running on Mac, right? It doesn't really allow you to say, well, are you running on Yosemite? Are you running on El Capitan, whatever the new thing is called? Like, how would we do that?
So, I mean, that seems like not what this API is meant to do, first of all.
Yes, no, and my question is like, is this by design or something we want to add in the future? If so, how will we do this? I mean, you could imagine that, we just extend the enum and have basically OS X, blah, foo, whatever, right? And then, I don't know, maybe that's the way.
I think that you either you add more API for that, but I don't know that .NET should, I guess I don't really know, but you wonder we'll give you enough to tell you what operating system you're on, but then once you have that, like you kind of, there's got to be some something you can do that sort of based on the fact that, all right, I'm on OS 10. Can I figure something out? Like by now I can drop down to something that's OS 10 specific and probe it in some way to figure out more information about it.
And maybe we can help, put reusable libraries that do that dirty work for you. But I think like trying to push that all into one version info class is just going to be very.
Right. I think to keep this thing simple, like its purpose is like there's some broad like different what we consider completely different ports of CoreFX, and sort of like you can sort of ask which one you're.
I see. Other things that might end up on here is like asking, what process architecture am I on, or
things that we can sort of answer definitively and that aren't sort of.
We know an OS isn't just going to lie to you unless you wrote some manifest.
I have a question about that. Like, if you're going to add that stuff, why would it be added here? I'm just curious.
Part of the reason is we want it to be in a completely isolated library and it's disconnected from the full framework and not bound by that version rules that exist there.
So there's never going to be a point in time where you can rev those APIs. So
it's going to limit our agility to be able to change this to like we want to just basically support any platform wherever. So.
And the other question I have is like if you can see like future things like process architecture, whatever, like will that go here in runtime information and this becomes like another kind of bucket class where we add this type of stuff? Or is it better to kind of componentize it more? So like, and this is a terrible name, but like, should there be like an OS checker or something and all the OS related checker stuff goes there, and then maybe like process architecture, like just like sort of have your componentizing the framework itself. In CoreFX, do you componentize the API, or do you have yet another bucket type that's sort of like environment and like runtime environment?
You can imagine if we went back to the structuring and call that OS platform, we put a static API, is this the OS? And so it's all self-contained within the one type potentially.
Popping one level up, we are now discussing like the details of the APIs. I thought there were some like comments on, is this even the right way to approach it? Not whether it's an enum or a struct, whether it's, flags. Like, are we discussing the high level issues today or not?
Whether like how version checks are supposed to be done in general, or I mean,
there's no versions here.
Exactly. So I mean, this one kind of.
I feel like that's
so. I mean, the one thing that did come up in the comments on the GitHub discussion was like, if this problem should just be solved with conditional compilation, right? Like handle these things at like configuration time, or when you build it, have if-defs or whatever. Like, do you want to even make these dynamic checks?
I think you do. I'll say strongly that you absolutely do want to be able to do this dynamically, because like their if-defs sort of have a price to pay in complexity and build time and packaging, etc. And there's a cost benefit there. Like when you get a certain one of the purposes, like to scale, what I find like developing cross-platform like is that to scale you kind of want like some things at the bottom to sort of go ahead and fan out to the multiple platforms, but then be able to build things on top. But then every once in a while, you have a library that's sitting perfectly in your design at the right layer, and there's just one little like place where you need to fan out, and like you don't know how like refactor your build and like have like 4 more DLLs now because you had to handle this one case. And I mean, it's not that. I think what happens is we often get into this like this false dichotomy between like write once, run anywhere, and like if-defs, but it's really not that. It's like there's a spectrum, and being able to do it dynamically fits perfectly into that spectrum. Like,
and the complexity of creating a portable NuGet package is so much higher than just making a call to this and then having purely portable library.
Right. And it's really a question of, what the library does and how much different it's going to be on each platform to implement. You imagine some libraries, like they're so fundamentally different, like they wrap a crypto API, right? So from the operating system, every single call is different. Like this is a reasonable thing not to like check at runtime, because like you're gonna have to write all the code again. Like file system strikes me like that lower kind of things, but every once in a while you're up higher and you're like 99% portable, and you just need to know one place just to kind of just get that escape hatch, and that's what I see this API as.
Even if we ignore cross-platform, and if we just focus on one platform, from version to version, you have the same exact problem. I mean, and you generally want to have a model of looking up, like, maybe get proc address on Windows is one example, or you look and see whether or not this exists on the OS and then use it. You're doing that runtime as opposed to having two if-def binaries, one for Win7, one for Win8, one for threshold or whatever.
And you can just look at the sample code that Frida submitted, right? Which is basically just making it simpler to ask you which which environment variable should I eventually ask for, right? Stuff like that. It's very simple to do with this API, right?
And stuff like this is actually a really good example of a lot of times our feedback is instead of looking for the operating system, just look for the thing you want, and if it's not there, fall back to the other one. Like, people could stupidly set home on Linux. And we can't do that kind of check here. We can't depend on it. We want to use a standard one. We don't want to let bad user data get in the way of good experience.
Yeah. I mean, another argument obviously is that maybe we should have an API that gives you this, but I mean, whoever implements an API for CoreFX, how would you do that? And I mean,
and this is just an example. We're not going to
exactly.
And I feel like we're whacking holes if we take that approach.
Yes.
Like every time we say, "Oh, we should have a universal API," someone will find something else in this. Like,
well, I think it's an eventual fallback. It's good, but I also think that we want to obviously make standard things as simple as possible and not force this on everybody, right?
Right.
I would argue that home folder is probably in the standard category.
I think that the thing that's important is like to kind of separate, like, this is an API. It's perfectly viable. It tells you something very definitive. It's very well defined. Am I running on Linux? Yes or no? Am I running on Windows? Yes or no? Am I running? And then, as there are other a bunch of things came up, like, oh, well, it's rarely the right thing. Well, it's correct in what it does. And then if for things like, is the file system case sensitive? We should never use this as an excuse not to have that. Like, file system API is lacking if it can't tell you if the file system, the elements that you're trying to compare, has a case sensitivity, because that seems like something that the general CoreFX should give you. So like, we should also be mindful. Like, to me, it's just I saw a lot of back and forth about like, this is never right. Let's not have this like kind of checks, because the right thing to do is like to query the capabilities, and like we should make sure that we also track the sort of like, or do we have holes in this? Like, is the usage of this API in some cases could still point to holes in CoreFX. So, and I don't think it refutes that this API should be there. So I think there was some debate along those lines, but I think that we should make it clear as a design goal that just because you could do it this way doesn't mean that it's not pointing out the fact that there's sort of a missing API, to sort of solve it from a functional aspect rather than a which OS aspect.
So you see, so I asked the question whether we are talking about the higher level, kind of what is the architecture of the API versus the design, because I raised this issue at the thread, and I feel like we are spending way too much time discussing whether it's a flag enum or not flag enum, this and that. I buy that the space is very difficult in general designing an API for these kind of scenarios. But if we decided we're not going to tackle the bigger issue, we are designing an API that is basically a query. Like, I'm asking, am I running on this OS? It should be a 15 minutes design. Like,
I agree. I'll take either one of either one, the string or the enum with the bool minus the flags. I didn't like the flags, but I think it's well defined and it does what it says, and and the fact that this query can be misused is something that can guide other discussions. Like, gee, people are using, we can get some information about when people are using this. If everyone seems to be using this to answer a question that would be better suited by another API, then we can have a meeting to discuss those other APIs. But I don't think any of that refutes this basic API as something that is good and that we should have.
And if somebody can propose an API that solves versioning problems, also, it's a separate project, right?
I agree.
So Stephen asked this question and says, to play devil's advocate for all of this, why not just expose the equivalent of uname and let the caller deal with the resulting data however they like? Repopulate appropriate data for Windows, delegate to uname, difficult to p-invoke, etc. Does anybody know what uname is? Because I don't.
Uname is a call on Linux, and Mac has it as well, that basically gives you a string with information. Like, you get the kernel version, you get some stuff. like it will tell you Linux on OS X. When you run it, it'll tell you Darwin. So you can kind of use that to parse your way. You think of it like a
User agent string.
User agent string.
Yeah. So I think we have tons of prior for why that's probably not a good idea, right? User agent strings and version checks on Windows.
Well,
But isn't what we're doing just kind of like a less powerful
so
version?
to be honest with you, like I'm not opposed to that. Like the fact, like if it's well defined, like I would apply the same principle. Like if it's like the uname is uname as we know it on Unix derived operating systems, and on Windows we define it as such, and like we had to also be mindful of the idea that like just because something can be misused means like it shouldn't be exposed. I think is a very very expensive process for us, like when designing things, and so like it can also be used for lots of legitimate purposes, not the least of which is just to send telemetry back to just figure out where you happen to be running to gather like some data. I mean, the user agent string is like, sure, yeah, I can write a bad web app that sort of like is not lighting up properly on it, or I could be gathering
I would say
that are perfectly good. And so I don't know that, like, I think that having something like this is good because it's very it's crisp for that. Like, I want to take a branch and it's very well defined and there's no parsing. But I also think that something like uname is not a bad idea for other reasons, like because it's also something that you may want to. And if you were totally stuck, let's all be honest too. Like we've all been stuck before on one platform or another and sort of like fell to whatever sort of escape hatch we could find to sort of make progress based on the fact that something was behaving differently in two different environments, and you start searching for how can I branch here, and like that's the pragmatic the thing is like
if we are going to use uname, I mean like maybe if you are going to parse anyway, maybe you can return like XML instead. I mean, and at that time, I mean, like XML. No, I'm serious. XML can be extended actually because, like today we define platform. We define platform only. I mean, if we decided to define process architecture, for example, we can add another element without changing the API at all. And if anybody interested can just parse it and get whatever they need. But yeah, I mean, I'm still liking the simplest way we have today about just telling this is a platform. And
I would say in general, I'm with Nick. We shouldn't be too protective, but we have lots of evidence that uname APIs cause problems, and we don't have evidence that we actually need uname APIs. I mean, initially when we designed the APIs, it was for Matt and Steve, who actually need it for real scenarios, and it seems to be meeting their requirements. I don't understand why we would add a shotgun.
Well, so I mean, the question was,
I don't see these as mutually exclusive, but
yeah, we can later. So if later we discover, geez, we need more power, we need versions and this and XML, we can always add it later. But I would start with something super simple that actually does the job. And
yeah, we agree that we want an API like this. It's easy. You're going to fall into the pit of success, and maybe we also want an escape hatch, but we don't know.
The problem is, I mean, this in some kinds, I think the devil is more or less in the presentation more than anything, because if you look at APIs, usually what happens quite frequently, I think version one of these examples, where people have some approach in their head, but they're thinking it always from the escape hatch perspective. So they're starting basically with the wrong approach because the APIs are not guiding them. Right? And so what ends up happening is people do it incorrectly, not because they're stupid or because the APIs are hard to use, but just because the API just matched their most intuitive way of thinking, which is then very fragile in the future, versus what Windows did, where you basically say, am I running on this? You basically construct something that basically says the operating system version and the whatever it is. Then basically what happens is people get it wrong. Windows has to do some crazy stuff, and then we have the escape hatch and the good API, but people are not using the good API because it's next to the one that they already have in their head. And so if we have an escape hatch and there's something that we think is better, then the argument would be maybe we should just go a bit out of our way to hide the escape hatch and not put it right next to it, maybe put it in a namespace that is less discoverable or whatever it is, right? And I think that would basically be, you don't block it. If you need it, you really need it. but you basically say, there's a speed bump of like, first you discover the good API, and then if that doesn't work for you, then you start Googling and you find the escape hatch version of that.
Yeah.
I mean, one way to do that is just ship this first, right? People get used to it. It gets, search engine ranking. How do I do this in .NET? Then later down the road, well, we have this API.
And it lets us discover more scenarios where this API is not good enough, and maybe we add, other APIs that are also not as powerful as the new thing.
Yep, that's a good argument.
I think it's pretty clear that like the dynamic version of like basically the level that we have of today for building core effects like statically differently is like useful, and so that's this API, and like we should. It sounds like we almost pretty much don't have any objection to that as like to this basic query, like of those 3 to 4 to n values, sort of being and a bool answer. So sounds like that is like everything else that's been discussed has been like potential future API.
Yep,
that's what I hear. Like
there are potential, but there are some asks for like the architecture. Particularly, like there's that already come in, right? And then there's also like potentially an ask for like query of a platform API, so that such that like I can know I'm safe to deal import this thing or whatever PMBOK into this API. Those are the two I think I've heard that we might come onto this runtime information class at some point in the future.
So I think if we basically mostly talk about the shape of this API, then Dylan has the question of why wouldn't we just extend the existing operating system class? I think before we looked into this, like why does this one not work for us?
So we discussed this already on the issue, and the main problem was because versioning. Now if we want to add basically the platform OS, the existing platform ID enum is very bad. It has a lot of values which cannot be supported. It has a lot of platforms that are not supported anymore. And there are lots of values that are same in different platforms. So do we want to bring all these problems forward and support them? And then the second thing is like if you want to add a new version now, then we are attached to the desktop release, which happens only once in a year or something like that. Then we need to keep all the platforms similar, so that a contract can run on any platform, and you don't have to worry like in which platform you're running, it's gonna work or break. So then the release of other NuGet packages gets stalled to match with the existing desktop version. So that's why we wanted to go with a separate implementation in its own package and not be tied to desktop.
That makes sense.
Is that a principle you guys are doing like in general for PowerFX? Because that's the thing that like concerns me a little bit is like you have the existing APIs, and I'm not saying the existing APIs are great in this case, but like I'm just curious, like where you fall as a general principle of like, do you lean more towards like, well, we can't update the existing APIs now, but we want to be more agile, so we're always going to create like a new API.
Hope not.
That's where I feel like you're treading into.
We would like to have the smallest core, and then as much as possible be just out-of-band portable libraries.
We like that, but it was very clear if you look at CoreFX, like we didn't reinvent all the API, right? I mean, and nor should we. And,
we took the other direction in some cases, just like where we're basically exactly match.
I think that what I hear is like there's some nice to haves for sort of breaking apart from the legacy, in that you can create a new library that can just sort of version on its own and get better on its own, and can sort of leapfrog the older API because it sort of gains some agility from breaking free from that legacy. But I think that there needs to be like another reason, right? It's not enough to be like, I'll get more agility. Like we will not use that as a reason, like, and we haven't, as far as I know, and we shouldn't. I'll assert that we should not ever say the reason why this API is new is because I can version it better than the old one, because that is going to fragment the .NET framework for reasons that are not that are sort of have to do with our engineering process and not to do with the platform that we're building, that like the experience that we're trying to give developers. Now, I think that what happens though is that, like, I heard a second part of what Priya was saying, which is like, well, actually this existing type is sort of, sort of has a set of problems, and And I think it has to be a very deliberate thing that says that this thing is something that we're willing to sort of put behind us, and then for these specific reasons that it is not adequate. Like, I think that when we decide to replace something, we clearly want to, if possible, replace it in this easier to version like thing. But if something has no good reason to be replaced, then I will assert it should not be replaced. And that is, I think, like, so that would be my thinking there. Like,
I think like before we started Windows 8, like there was a separation of like, exchange type versus utilitarian type, which Mitch also used to decide the factoring and not put exchange and utilitarian in the same contract. And these kind of APIs are essentially utilitarian, right? They're static helpers. I mean, sure, there's some types defined that you pass in, like the Enum, but they're not the ones that you pass around in the entire app usually, right? Versus list of T, well, you shouldn't pass it around. People in practice do pass it around. I mean, all the interfaces for sure, like are enumerable. So for those kind of things, if you would break apart for more agility, but first of all, for interface, you don't gain anything because they're already immutable. But for abstract types, there's a limit to what you can do like stream, right? Like at some point, the question really is, does it make sense to break the ecosystem just so that we have the option to add more APIs? And so I think in general, our, percentage-wise, I think we start with the assumption we don't deviate until we have good reasons to actually do it, because there is obviously value in just keeping things compatible. Source migration, just moving to .NET Core. It's already hard enough, given that we removed a bunch of APIs, but if you also change a bunch of APIs, it's really not helping anymore.
But I think another thing that we're going to be, potentially being able to do is sort of like, just because, is we can have like the desktop will ship when it ships, which will be, less often than something that comes on NuGet.
Yep.
Just like that seems obvious, but that doesn't mean that these APIs can't sort of go. I try them first on .NET Core, and then eventually they flow back to the desktop, right? I mean, we have to be willing to do that. So I feel like if something, and so like that again, just to reiterate the point that like if something is perfectly viable, like yes, it means that there's some engineering cost to us, but it's the right thing for the platform to keep that thing as it is, that is perfectly viable, moving forward everywhere. And maybe that means that I see it first, or definitely that means that I'll see it first, if I'm using .NET Core. But I think that, we need to be committed to sort of this single thing that's still the right thing for that scenario is the thing to evolve to answer this next question, and that thing needs to flow back, but that the timing will be what is feasible, right? In terms of when you see it, if your target is the full framework, but not that you won't see it. And then I don't think there's really, a problem there.
So, like, in order to make that maybe even wrap up an hour early, that would be fantastic. Which will not happen. But is there any pushback on the API shape? I mean, somebody said they would prefer not to use an Enum because they say, or I think Jordan said, Enums generally suggest a fixed, well-known set of values. Since .NET Core is going to be ported to run on different OSs and unknown set, I think using a struct string approach is better. But I think, from what we discussed earlier, that they're more or less the same thing with various different flavors. But I think either one would work, so I don't care too strongly.
I prefer struct, but I'm fine with Enum too.
I started leaning towards the string one after various conversations here, so I kind of like the struct idea with the create method as opposed to a constructor.
I like that as well.
Yeah.
So what do you think of complexity? I mean, it should be fairly easy for us to version either one, right? We just add this type once, and then it's just adding a field over time, so it should be all the same.
One drawback of having the string one is the performance of is platform OS is going to be now doing string comparisons multiple times and various times. If it's in the perf-sensitive cases,
doesn't need to, right? Like if you use the static, read-only things, then you can do just pointer checks, right? And then
you
have
can
a
do it as
slow
an
pop that does
optimization
the
step,
string.
yes, potentially. But if you're not using
I would make those.
We could have construct be a 2 wide thing, which is a string and an end. You could do in comparisons.
But you still have the same problem as with an Enum that if you're doing in comparisons.
If it's private, if it's a private field, then you can do as you please.
I mean, I would say most strings are short, and hopefully you're not using the OS check in a tight loop. So that's hopefully not.
They could be one character long. They could be for the very, for the first 6 operating systems.
Oh no, but
I
you
don't
could
think the
write,
string
you could
comparison.
write, you could write it. You could write a
The
fast.
string's probably going to be interned. The string equals does the reference equals check before it tries to like start comparing.
I was just throwing it out there as another thing.
I'm not worried about it either. I think they should be properties and not fields, but that's. I actually think it will be faster to just because you'll end up inlining it to like return the. You just like have the getter just.
So I think there's precedent for having them as fields, like other structs similar like this or use fields like.
CoreFX has 10 public static fields.
And that's all.
But
you got.
Yeah.
What are they?
Some of them are in the metadata reader. That was actually a lot of them. The rest are in the registry. HK current user, things like that. Because we did the research on this because we had a similar issue with Roslyn, and we looked at CoreFX, and CoreFX had it. But it's possible you guys have static public fields, but I was more prepping for public static.
Yeah, so like, I don't know, like daytime max value and stuff like that, I think are public static fields.
Yeah, after I did not include Corelip in that search because Corelip's not in CoreFX.
So what's the difference in having a public static read-only field or a static read-only property? I mean, there is no read-only property, but static properties.
More metadata.
I'm not particularly.
Why people
I would just
use
go with
static
like what
properties?
daytime, like all the existing things. use.
To make some changes in the future.
But in this case, you're not really gonna so generally so there's the general
It's
there's
a
the
prompt and it's a
general
value
question,
type. So.
which is like you kind of promising that you have to manage to initialize these fields in your static
then why not make
constructor.
it constant?
So you can't do things like I'll only allocate Linux if somebody ever asks me for like this is going to be like 3 intern strings. So let's be clear that I'm not talking about this example. But like a property would allow each property to sort of on its own sort of. Whereas if you have a static read-only field, then you're basically beholden to like have initialized them all once the static construction takes place, and so that becomes part of your contract.
Yeah.
But I actually think that even there may be a perf argument. I could be wrong. I'd have to see the code gen. But just from the fact that this struct has just a string, that you would basically you'd have the getter would be equivalent to like return Linux quote, and like would be the fastest thing actually.
Yeah.
Versus sort of going to get a field with the it would be like I think you would save an indirection, but maybe the code generators are better than I imagine. But
The JIT can't inline that.
The JIT
no, we can definitely inline it. But if it's a field, it's going to be like, oh, it's a field.
Why
So,
don't-
That's a myth. It's a read-only, so it's
I see.
always going to be a copy.
I see.
Why did we not make it constant?
There's no method call you can make your will not use.
Because it's a struct you can't
It's a
make
string.
out.
Never. I keep thinking it's a string. Never mind.
Right.
It really is a string.
So we had the guidance.
Better as a property is what I'm. That's what I
We
think.
had the guidance to use properties forever, and as Jared mentioned, we only have 10 fields. And we tried to change the guidance in the past. Some people may remember on a couple of occasions. It always backfired. It's so strange because you look at this API and it's like, yeah, we should just use fields. It's so simple. And then we discover like data binding doesn't work. So maybe it's not important for this API, but then we discover debugger viewers don't work, or this doesn't work. Like our ecosystem is so fragile when it comes to public fields of tools. Having said that, when you look at it, it's like, geez, that should be a field.
I think the only argument really in this case is probably just consistency, right? I mean, probably either one will just work and not bite us too much. But when in doubt, I think being consistent is usually a good answer, right? Anybody disagree with that?
Nope.
Consistent with what?
But all general guidance to use read-only properties as
We do have.
Typo there.
Oh yeah, no, I cannot type on that one screen. That's misleading.
So, Ima, you raised interesting or proposed interesting change to remove the constructor and make it a factory method.
Yeah.
I think it would be very nice, except structs have a constructor no matter
They always have a default.
whether you. So,
But you don't get like the nice IntelliSense documentation. Like you can do it, but
empty OS name, you're gonna get.
yeah, like what is that?
Hopefully, it's pretty intuitive.
by the way, what is the meaning of MTOS name?
I think the implementation treats it as like
Another value.
doesn't do anything.
It basically always returns false. Is that
I imagine just like equals.
so? Maybe it's not a like. Maybe we should change the constructor to create method or.
I think we should just for discoverability. Otherwise, we people are always going to call new OS name.
Yeah, and start searching for strings and like.
Hmm.
And I guess the last question I have is whether or not OS name is still the right thing, or should we call it OS platform?
Yeah. I was gonna say that. Like, I don't really like the OS name thing because when I think of name, I think of like the name of the OS, like Yosemite. You know, like
The marketing name?
Yeah.
Right, I think that's
My
my.
only thing.
The intent is like that there's a set of values here, and the fact that it's a name is sort of how we make them unique, but not sort of the thing that you want to know about when you're using the API. Like using the API is like this value equals this other value. Is this thing? I pass the value on. And when I'm reading the code, I don't like if I'm reading code, it's like there's nowhere do I care that it's a name. Like if I'm using these static properties, right?
Yeah. What about family or identifier?
Well, I don't mind the OS platform.
I don't mind
OS
OS
platform ID, even possibly.
What's the name of the existing type? Just platform.
Platform ID.
Yeah, it's just called platform ID.
And we also have,
So maybe we shouldn't add ID then, because then it's somewhat confusing.
and we also already have an operating system class. I mean, you wonder if it can't just be.
I don't know. I find OS platform a bit strange because what's the difference between platform and OS?
Can it
Good
just
question.
Can it just be OS?
So it's like,
Is that too?
yeah, if we could just call it OS,
Oh, that says even more characters.
But we also, so would we really end up with a? So remind me what the shape of the existing operating system class looks like.
We can just open MSDN, right?
It's
And
a
are we
it's
sure
a
that-
wraparound version and platform ID.
What you do is you call environment.os version, and that returns operating system, an instance of operating system, and that has a platform property of type platform ID.
Okay, so we do seem to call these things platform. Basically, we tend to think of operating system as having, or I don't know. Because if we were just,
I see. So it is a class that has platform version. Not like service pack.
sorry,
having said that, I wouldn't pay too much attention. This API was designed without any, or without.
no,
even
but
flows.
I guess that.
This is designed by you?
No, I think that.
That's what I heard.
I think it's so. I heard.
Trying to avoid expensive.
I heard earlier like a whole bunch of problems with the existing API, but I do think it is important to at least think about how they look side by side. Because remember that like, in a desktop project, like you will see both, and sort of like if they are sort of like completely inconsistent, it's still going to look wrong. So it's still worth looking at the old APIs. Like I agree. Like you don't have to be. Anyways, like can it just be platform? Then or
Is it possible we are going to extend this in the future? I mean, not just the name, not just
The
like.
struct, probably not. The runtime information class, I expect will have more stuff to it.
one time that is platform. I don't know.
Because like we can call it like info instead of name or ID. So this gives us some.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to add more stuff to it, so I don't think info is.
We could call it operating system.
We already have a type called operating system.
This really unfortunate thing is they all live in the system aspect, so they're pretty much imported by default.
Right. You can't.
He said for synonyms.
But what about okay? Well, I don't think OS platform is that bad personally. I'm gonna just put a vote in for that because
put OS family. Like, I know we kind of briefly touched on that, but that would allow us to say, Linux family, which we could break down to, version numbers and things like that. And then that gives us more flexibility to say.
We should avoid embedding version numbers into this.
No, but it's not a version number. It's just saying it's really what they are, right? All of these are sort of broader like than.
You like that? Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea.
No idea what we just talked about, right?
No, I have.
Tell me the right answer.
Is OS family the proposal?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Because it also gets across that we never add versions to that, right? Because it just gives you the flavor. So we would collapse, and it's just basically is this the same family or not?
It's like Windows NT and Windows 9X, correct?
Right. What is that?
Windows is the family.
That's what we didn't actually decide that, right? Because no, to be fair, we talked about like the BSDs, but we didn't say for sure, and and we didn't decide, for sure whether we would split up sort of these things, and it's arguable that their families or not is sort of debatable, right? Like they're, it's like how distantly are they related, before they become indistinguishable from, sort of like,
would there be a Unix that Linux?
Yeah, so Steve and I were talking about this just now, actually. If there would be some, POSIX type thing where you could say, oh, I'm coding, to some POSIX standard, and so then Linux and OS X both answer true for that, and when BSD comes online, answers true, and then your code kind of just works.
So then you could have, so this design doesn't prohibit from having
more detailed.
No, from having more than one thing return true.
OS X, Windows, POSIX, and then is OS platform on Linux could return true for Linux and POSIX, right?
Right. But then I wonder if, so I think that would actually be great to use that flexibility. I actually do think it might be confusing if the name is OS family. Then it's almost like, but I could still live with that. I just think I
OS
multiple families.
OS must be the only term in computer science that doesn't have synonyms. It's not not overloaded.
So I pasted in a bunch of examples of how other platforms do. I don't know if there's any names in there that we could mine.
Exactly.
In the comments. I don't know if you want to pull it up.
But not operating system.
Like another.
It's in the GitHub issue comment.
So even ignoring Linux platforms and stuff, how do we think about Windows Phone and Xbox and things like that are conceptually part of the Windows family?
Right.
Not those just Windows family. I know for whenever you go on the PRG and things happen, it's don't check for specific things, do feature probing once you know what family it is.
Right. So I really think that Steve and I were talking about this as well. These conversations are only happening in secret because he can't talk on the phone. So because we didn't call him in, but I think that the guidance for once you sort of know what OS you're on, how you do probing is going to differ between OSs, because Windows is very much pushing towards this light up model where they do the version number lie stuff. So you kind of have to say, oh, is this API there? On Linux, man pages say, oh, we added this API in this version of the kernel, or whatever, this sort of stuff. So
right
there, it may make more sense to expose some version that we pull out of the uname struct, and when you're on a POSIX system, you have uname and you can get a version, and then you can kind of go from there. But I think an overarching version thing is, or an overarching light up thing is going to be hard to design, since the platforms seem to want to handle it
so
much differently.
It feels like maybe we should think about having sort of a standard sort of like a POSIX kind of a library and sort of a Windows light up kind of a helper, and sort of some classes to help with some of these scenarios that are specific to that let you sort of drop down levels.
So Mono has some of this stuff, right? They have their mono.posix library, and there have been requests on GitHub for us to either support that or give all the things that are necessary so it can compile on top of CoreFX. One of the things that Steve and I were talking about too is if we end up, and I don't want to sidetrack this with how do we expose POSIX stuff or whatever, but we will, when we have those discussions, need to understand if we add some contract that is platform specific, then it means that things that consume it become platform specific, and we're trying to design at least some of these APIs where you can ship a pure MSIL library that just does dynamic checks at runtimes.
Another interesting side note is, when you talk about versions, is also like, what are you doing with the version information? So if you look at what Windows 10 did, for example, with the Universal Platform, they basically have specific APIs that allow you to ask for API. So they basically say, don't check for versions ever, just ask whether the API is there, if that's why you ask for the version number. So I think
sometimes it's used because you want to pass some argument to an API, like they've added some new flag value, right? And like, it's hard to test. Like on Windows, sometimes, hopefully the API returns that argument if you call it with the thing, but it's hard sometimes to.
So maybe we should call it feature set.
And
then the query method is supported. And then feature set can be Windows. It means all features that exist in all the Windows. But then you can have arbitrary groupings.
That seems a bit more like a grab bag.
Yeah, and people aren't going to look like the mental model is
I think we should say OS or platform.
But we also don't want this API to actually be used very frequently, which is.
No, I don't
know that that's a statement that we want to make.
I don't agree with that. I don't think this API is dangerous at all. It's like very, very clear what it does.
Depends what you do after the check passes.
No, it's dangerous, but that's true of everything. Like, I mean, at some point, like, it's extremely crisp. It does exactly what it says, and like, it's for me, that's more of a litmus test than well, if I put the wrong thing in the if block, like, you can't really stop. Like that's sort of like, and like at some point, you can't prevent that by API design. I don't believe.
So, I mean, generally, is it fair to say, like, runtime information is general purpose enough, so if it would support architectures, it would just add a new method? And then even if it would do feature set moving forward, we could just add a new method.
I agree with that, yes.
So it doesn't have to be.
Well, we would add a new method. Would we add a new type to represent feature set?
I mean, it depends on what the feature set does, but I could imagine that we...
it may be just string-based, doesn't like, does this API or this platform API exist, or these other pieces?
So,
I mean, Windows, for example, like when you look at how they did it, they basically have methods where you can check for types, you can check for members on a type, and you can ask for an API contract. And I think even the last one is just a very long string with some very specific format. I don't think you're passing the name and the version independently. I think it's literally just one string. But I may be wrong on that one. But I mean, you could easily have just overloads, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be new types necessarily.
So the name of this assembly is system runtime.environment. Is the only thing that's basically ever going to be added to this assembly going to be in the system.runtime interrupt services namespace? And does that mean that the name of the assembly should be different? I don't know.
Yeah,
I suspect the only thing that's going to ever be in here is this type.
So I think that means that runtime information should probably be in the if you really think that's true. I mean, yeah, I think it depends whether we think that's true or not. But generally speaking,
what else are you going to add here?
In the cases where there's one type serves as the sort of the entry point to the concept that the library is trying to express, we've used that type name in the name of the library, and I think that.
So if we start doing version number-y stuff, I suspect we would put it in here. It's less clear to me that we're going to be able to do so by just jamming data onto runtime information. Like, I can imagine the design of the API is such that there's concrete types for different version numbers for OSs that are specific, and you do a test. And
in a lot of cases, we have a contract that's called, system.xml.x document.
Yeah.
There's a whole ton of types involved, but it still sort of gives you the idea. It's like X document is like the sort of entry point, right? So like, is that how this is going to evolve? Like, there'll be some enums and everything, but it's like, when I need to get some information about the runtime, I start on runtime information. It feels like that's where we're headed, but maybe not. But if we are, it doesn't mean that we can't add a bunch more types. It just would mean that so we could do whatever we want. Just the name is just the DLL is just the name of the DLL, but we would be consistent with to use the type name.
Yes,
and including the namespace, by the way.
That's a bit long though.
It is a bit long.
System runtime.interrupt services.
That seems like that seems long.
So just so everyone knows, we discussed this, I think, the first time we were talking about this API, and it was in the comments, but the DNX folks have a similar concept to this thing. It's called iRuntime environment, and it lets you get the operating system version, the runtime type, which is CLR, core CLR, or mono, and runtime architecture, and runtime version. And it gives you all these things back as strings.
Where does it get it information directly?
They have, I think some of it is hard coded. Sometimes they call uname. And there was we had talked previously about if we adopt some sort of query-based design by this, we should talk to the DNX folks about, instead of exposing some string operating system, can they move it to some sort of query-based thing on top of this?
So I guess I would like what it would be interesting to see, like, in terms of early adopters of DNX and sort of what drove the design of what they have and how much usage there is, and if they you know, and
they
so,
added this relatively soon or recently in like beta 5, I think, in the middle of beta 5. They use it in some places, I think, to do these, like, am I on OS X, then the Kestrel or the libuv name that I need to load is called this, load it up, whatever.
So I guess a more direct version of what I was asking is like, so like this API is relatively new on both sides, so we should be trying to be convergent, but like a litmus test here is like, suppose one remove this runtime information from DNX early adopters that are out there and they only had this API, how well served would they be? And if they wouldn't be well served, you know, what have we missed? Like, because we there's some things on the what I mean. Also, there are some things like the version we're saying no, we don't, like, we've explicitly come to an agreement that we don't want to do something like that. But it seems like that we at least have some sort of test of that theory that says that no, you know, this is not what we want. We want something like this, which is to look at usage of that API.
I think it may be more correct to say that for version, I think we have concerns about exposing Windows version information. It may be that exposing version information for OS X or Linux or BSD is the right thing to do, right? It is something that the platform wants you to do. And so if that's true, we may need to go do that. I think Steve had made this comment that, like, this isn't like those platforms aren't like Windows, right? And so some of the guidance that we have sort of ingrained into our brains may not be the right thing.
Sure.
I would say we should like decide what we want with this API, check it in, and then go to DNX people and say, hey, what if we consolidate the APIs? If they say, we absolutely need the version number, and here are the reasons for, well, then we just had version.
Do you want to own that? Because you already are joining the other conversations about conversions.
It's just I will wait till the API is checked in.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, another comment that we just saw, which is, I think, very much in alignment with that, is that Dylan is saying, I think this API should not use names of releases, but the ones of the kernels. Different releases of Mac OS X all use the Mac kernel, Windows releases all the Windows kernel, Linux distributions all use the Linux kernel, which is kind of true, right? I mean, the question on Windows, for example, would we consider AppX the platform, right? Would we basically have Windows AppX, for example, whatever the name is we choose?
Are they saying like NT and Darwin versus Windows?
So I think it's more like conceptual, right, as opposed to just say. I mean, if you look at BSD and Linux, they have different kernels, right? They're conceptually the same thing, but there are different implementations of the kernel, right? So the question is, what does this thing actually represent that you get back?
So then instead of OS name, we have kernel name. That maybe.
I wouldn't do that because actually, you're very rarely sort of tied to the kernel. Like, if I could bring up a reasonable GNU-based system like that doesn't have a Linux kernel, like most of the things that I want to do might well work. I'm not really interacting at the kernel level, like generally in my programs, but so I don't know if it's
some of it may not be anything to do with kernel.
Yeah, I mean,
what about runtime environment? The assembly is called environment. We just call it runtime environment.
There's an existing class called runtime environment in this namespace.
And I say that every single term has been overloaded except for.
Well, that's sort of the thing that like is a little frustrating for me is just like we have system.environment, we have system.interrupt services or system runtime interrupt service.runtime environment. Now we're adding yet another like bucket type thing. It's like in the future, like if you removed your constraint right now, where you can't update system environment, would these APIs go in system environment?
So
I don't know. Like
to be fair, like yeah, maybe they would, right? So
It doesn't change. We would still need this
Yeah.
struct, correct?
Right.
What would you call it?
OS platform or whatever.
well,
I mean,
Whatever.
well, I mean,
But
That's
the
not the
query method
problem.
would go- is
That's not the
question
problem.
there with
you
the
could have
now
like
we have-
environment dot is is OS platform or whatever.
You know, we can remove the static runtime information and just put that method on the struct.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that.
The only thing is like when you start to look at the usage of it, then it becomes like whatever we call it, OS name dot is OS name dot, and you have like OS name in there 3 times. It just starts to look a little weird.
Yeah, no.
I think that's a good point. I mean, people would expect this to be an environment, right?
I mean, the question is, I mean, that's something where, I mean, I think you're right from the point of view, if we could, we probably would put it there.
Right.
But that constraint is not something that we can easily weaken up. So I think it is.
that's it.
But
like,
when
I
is
disagree with
really-
that. I feel like that's like a point in time thing that like there's some release constraints, but that I don't know.
We in general agreed that environment was just this grab bag of stuff that needed to be factored properly and better, which is, this is an attempt to factor some of the pieces out.
But you're creating a new grab bag.
Extensions, or I think so.
So this is the new
Well,
grab bag.
which
It's
is
it's not
very-
necessarily, I don't want this to become a new
Although
grab bag, I
it's
want this to
actually
be about the specific things for the OS and tech and that platform. Thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Not everything else that's on this.
So what's
If we get static extension methods, can we have it in both places?
We're not getting static extension methods.
Actually, we
They're on-
talk again with the language guys on extension everything. It's coming up again. So
Jared?
maybe.
Getting what?
Static extension methods?
Martin, I got some scores to learn things I want.
You could sort of do this, but I did with extension methods today, but actually I don't think you can because of the constraints. You could like add an extension method to operating system. The problem is you can't, I think you still can't, you haven't exposed the OS operating system, so it's too late to do that. But you could do that. So you could still have the existing environment.os version instead of .platform equals, it could be like .is platform or
could
something.
do that?
But again, I don't know if you could do it now. You'd have to wait. So
Could-
one question is like, does this have to happen now? Like, can it wait? Like, who needs it right this minute?
A lot of that
Cross-site stuff
cross-site
needs
work
it.
is starting to use.
So you're currently using this, or need to
So,
use it?
I mean, we
'Cause your
already
strategy
do-
now is build it is the if-def kind of.
So,
or
like,
the,
if it's
So
cons-
we do use some sort of like test like this in our tests a lot, right? Because the tests we don't build platform specific. We have these like attributes that say, and that say, oh, this only works on Linux, and then we also have some actual like checks that you can do outside of XUnit that say within a test you can say, am I on Linux? Then expect this, whatever. The DNX stack uses this a lot. So one of the problems that I found when I was bringing the DNX stack up is they had this assumption that if you were running on .NET Core, it meant you were running on Windows, because that used to be the case. And as we're bringing up .NET Core on Linux and Mac, we need to do these sorts of things like, oh, I'm on Linux, so I need to go p-invoke to this API, or this thing has this name. So sometimes you can handle that through their runtime environment thing. Other times they don't have access to that through their DI system, depending where they are. So,
I mean, the nice thing, I mean, do we feel that strongly about the place? Because, I mean, if we just put it on a new type that doesn't exist, everything is super simple. As soon as we put it on environment, yes, if K wants to use it, for example, on Core CLR, everything is hunky-dory. As soon as they want to use this thing on full framework, no, we're in trouble again. We would have to think of a way to expose it in a different type.
No, we could expose it in the next week.
But they have to run now on full framework.
Well, they already run on full framework down level, so they already have to deal with discrepancies. So if it's a point
True,
in time,
but the question
if
is,
it's a point in time discrepancy, they can deal with it. We can certainly deal with it. But yes, there's some, if we start using this everywhere, we're going to start to run into problems because some of the libraries that would start to use it would also be considered portable to the desktop. That we wouldn't be able to make it in a particular release. But if we were using it in specific places where we could account for that discrepancy, we might be able to do it that way. Like we might be able to have a version of runtime extensions that is considered newer than sort of the desktop, .NET 4.6, and that you can only use that, in the implementations of things that sort of, if it's in the course unit for Unix implementations of things that it doesn't really matter, we could potentially version system runtime extensions in advance of another release. We've not done this sort of free for all because each case has to be understood. What are the implications? Because we've basically tried to say, okay, all these libraries are going to run on 4.6. So more or less, it's been we start to. Doesn't mean we can start to version certain libraries like runtime extensions and be slated for like the next desktop release. But that would have implications for anyone who was using it, who was trying to run ship on NuGet and run on this release. So we'd have to be very careful, and that has costs, etc. But maybe I don't want it to sound like, no, we can't do that. Like we should never get to this place where we say, oh, well, that's like this like putting into the design of the thing that we're building the process with which we're building it. I think, and I don't think that should.
There are numerous implications of building these things in VS2. Like things like the designer runs on top of these things, so these APIs have to be in sync with the framework that the designer in VS is actually running on it, and for some of these things to actually work.
Yeah.
So no one can start consuming this new version of the API in ASP.NET Next or like.
Right. But yeah.
I think Nick's point is more like, as a matter of concern, we should not just fork because it makes our lives easier. We should find ways to actually make that work, which is generally subscribed to. Now, I think for this particular API, because the API service is very low, it's not like a super pervasively used feature where it would reset everybody. But at the same time, given the time we have left and given that this is one of the APIs we really need for cross-plat, I really do think it makes our life substantially easier if we don't put it on an existing type. This is why I'm asking, how strong do we feel about the location? Because I don't think it's a big deal if it's in a new type that ships out of band, but we know everything else would just work with that. As soon as we do something else, then it becomes this, oh yeah, it may work or it may not work depending on what the context is it's being used in. Plus it has the long tail of like libraries that can't use it because they want to run still on 4.5. And so, I mean, that seems to indicate that it's just easier.
Think that we,
I think the two options are either we do it as this design or we don't do it. So, you raised like a good question, which is, do we absolutely need this API?
As opposed to just using the existing one.
But I think we do absolutely need this API.
We decide that we already need it. I think that's the only practical option, frankly, at this point.
So in the future, when we want to add more this type of information or whatever, we're saying like from now on, like runtime information is basically where it's going to be added. Like we're not going to be adding stuff to environment anymore. So you're always going to have these two types. Actually, three types when you consider the runtime environment class as well.
That's going to be the general guidance, yes. There will always be exceptions to every rule, but yeah, that's the general guidance.
But I hope that it will not be like, and yet another one in a few years.
Right, exactly.
The moment it's an out-of-band library, we can now have so much more freedom to evolve it.
It's always tough when we're I said this a few times, like agility should not, like it feels like not the right, like the reason has to be like,
it's not
like the type is not the right reason.
We would never do like, okay, let's just look through APIs that we don't yet have out of band and maybe we can like start pulling them out without any other reason. But when a new reason comes up, this together with the agility, they kind of add up.
And if you look at the environment right now, it has very little stuff on it. So the things that it has is current managed thread ID, hash shutdown started, new line, processor count, tick count, and fail fast, and that's it.
But like,
Doesn't even have is that even exposed in .NET Core?
It is in system runtime extensions.
Yeah, but it's different in desktop and .NET Core.
Right. So I'm just looking at the contract.
But like honestly, operating system.
No, I'm not saying but it would be really bad if it's already grabbed back of a variety of things.
But like, I mean, you get the processor count and the thread ID and operating system. Like that doesn't seem wrong to me. But anyway.
No, it's not.
Yeah,
I'm just saying that given the guidance you just cited, like it would be consistent with that, given that the environment is so small today.
It's bigger in desktop.
It's bigger in desktop, but
presumably
it's bigger and you're looking at last release too. It's bigger now. It has like environment variables.
Although I think for the same argument you could make that maybe we put it somewhere else forward because that buys us more agility. But yeah, there is a general question how we deal with desktop interrupt. I mean, there are several ideas how we could make it work, but for things that are in MS Colab, I think it will always be super tricky. So environment will probably be narrow on that list for the same reasons. So
is there an existing like method on environment? This is a crazy idea. Not necessarily advocating for it, but like sort of like the get environment variable where it's sort of like a general like key value type, like give me the value for this key type thing, and
we have something like that with app context, right? And this is something that Matt Cohn brought up the last time we talked about this, was could we use app context to do this?
Sorry, app context is?
So app context is this new type that was added in
.NET, which is mainly
4, and basically it's like you can do a tri-state query basically. So there's like a try get, you give it a key and it gives you back a bool value. Is that right? That's how it works.
The API is sort of, so we absolutely could use it, but the API shape is not really what you want.
So the API shape was weird, and then so we talked about, well, could we add another API? And I think at that point we ran into these weird versioning constraints about that type being exposed from some very low-level contract that we were worried about.
App context itself is in MS Colab. But if we added it as another type in that contract, we could keep it segregated possibly.
Then the only question would be like adding things to that contract. Does adding things to that contract have implications? Like, does that contract ship as part of desktop?
Not the whole library, just the app context
type itself. App context itself.
The contract.
The contract itself is out of band.
Is out of band.
Yes.
Like,
so add new types into that contract.
It has a type forward into it. The thing that ships out of band running on desktop is just a forward. We could add other stuff to that thing.
But it's not like the facades that ship in desktop. Like
correct. It's not in the GAC or anything like that.
This facade into the desktop inbox.
Well, we made an explicit call not to put really
any
of the new ones. Yeah. So we can always add. We can add new types like that.
We can always add.
We can add new types that depend on the existing types, like to these ones. We can do that. But that's not the problem. The problem is that this is not what we're running into. Is we want to update existing types and we still not a good way to do it.
Yeah.
Although didn't we No.
So can we then make a decision here? Like, are we fine with that being on a separate time? Because we're going back and forth whether we can or cannot update it.
I think it's the least worst.
Design as is.
Sure.
I'm fine with it.
Are you fine with the name too? Runtime information?
Did we even call it the OS name version?
Runtime information is fine. OS name is a bit wacky, and I really don't like the names of the members. But having said that, I will say it again. I felt like we spent so much more time on this thing that we should. That I will take anything. Priya shouldn't decide.
So pick any name, not OS name.
Yeah, our guest can choose the name.
You choose the name, and here's the 15 constraints you have.
We can reject it.
Well, I mean, the way I just like to see the usage and then just like what feels right.
Oh, the usage we have, it's this one here, right?
So we're gonna keep it like this. OS platforms won't be plural.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, if you're just gonna make the structure OS platform.
So you want me to change that?
No.
That seems fine.
I mean, that seems.
So one more, despite the fact that I said we should move on. What about OS environment? It would be basically a runtime environment and OS environment. There's some parity to it. One is about the.
We can't call it runtime environment because it's already a type.
No, I said OS environment.
But it'd be runtime information OS environment.
So you like this? OS environment.
I see. Well, we change runtime information to OS
And I
environment.
suppose you would just say this.
It's supported.
Supported?
It seems very weird.
So what do you want? We went back and forth on that.
Is.
It's supported in
Could be is.
If you go back to just having the OS platform type, you could have like OS platform.is, OS platform.linux, and then you would get rid of the runtime information.
Just is no parameters.
Or is family.
And then
Is family, then OS
Yeah,
family,
like that.
whatever.
I don't know.
It just
No?
seems so
What
weird.
about- what about
It's
is
so
family?
weird.
At that point, you might as well just add the Boolean methods instead of
That's
the
right.
fields.
Yeah.
Just say is Linux. You mean, anyways, but that's starting to.
You can do that if you're using static on the OS platform. If you just do is when.
Was there anything wrong with that in the Bool properties instead of having the string constants?
The problem is, I still have to have a string. You'd have to. How do you do the free BSD case or whatever?
Yeah. That's
Is
the
it
jump
you?
case.
Well, but you do the create, right?
I think we had it. Why are we?
You say, you use
We
the
just had
vector
OS
to create
platform.
the-
That was the last change. That was fine.
But it's so fun to see.
Oh,
OS
okay.
environment.
Like static OS platform, and then do is.
Like a current platform, you could do like current platform, it's a lot more intuitive.
Yeah.
The whole thing was set up that way.
OS environment is incredibly more intuitive.
Yeah, so it does ask the question, sort of.
So OS.
Knock, knock.
So hang on, guys.
So previously, when it was runtime information, we thought if we had the ability to ask the question, what is your processor?
Right.
It would be there. Now, if it's OS environment, do we still expect it would be there, or do we have some other type that would?
I don't know why did we reset runtime information? Like that seemed like fine. We had already
I
discussed
actually don't
exactly
think-
that we would
I think
add
it's
stuff
reasonable
to
to
it.
ask you OS environment about the platform you're on, because OSs actually support multiple architectures too, like with WoW and other such things. So it's basically like, can I run x86? Can I run 64-bit or what pieces are going in? Sure. Possibly. I don't think it's that far of a stretch.
Runtime information is inviting a grab back, right? For sure.
But is that what we want? Like we clearly
That's
felt
the
like not
question,
necessarily a grab bag, but we felt like there were some related concepts that we wanted to place to put them, and that we. It seems like we didn't. Like, so we thought we had this whole discussion early on about like how componentized we wanted it to be, and it felt like there was people wanted to have like an entry point that was like the runtime information.
I would agree with that.
So now
I would actually.
why are we changing that now? Like, so like I'm not clear.
The only,
We want
the
a
only
grab
question
bag,
is runtime
but it needs to be open, not like 25 different keys. And
Yeah, runtime information, you'll end up putting other things in there potentially. Like, oh, what's the Core CLI version? What's the runtime?
But is
actual
that-
runtime version?
Well,
I mean-
would that be bad? Because I mean, I would
Right.
argue that
You want
the
it
actual
there.
CLR version, if we ever need to expose it, that will probably be a
Right.
good type to
These
expose
don't
it.
feel like things that like you say everything. I mean, if you put things that make no sense, but so far all the examples I've heard all seem fine. Like what processor, things about the CLR.
Yeah,
Those all
new
seem
line
like
you wouldn't
runtime
put here.
information, and those could all go
That
there.
would be wrong.
What would be wrong? Sorry.
New line, like runtime information dot new line, that would not living there. Or like environment variables, I also think would be living here.
And I can't believe I'm going to say this, but one question though about I do like runtime information better than going towards it, but we do have a lot of info in the framework. Should it be info?
We do. But we already have network information.
I think it was originally proposed as runtime info, and then there was a comment that was like, well, info's it's not really like the other infos in the framework. This is like because those are like instances of things, like,
I see.
and this is like a static,
Okay.
I don't know, that's,
I felt like it had to. I'm not. I'm
good. All right. So then we are fine with that type name too. So that. Let me just add it.
Does using OS follow the guidelines for abbreviations?
It does.
Yes.
I'm not.
We have the human effects club sitting here.
The OS 10 is a bit of an interesting one, but that's correct.
Oh, I meant like an OS platform.
That one's correct.
Is OS.
It's 2 letters, and so.
So just rename OS name to OS platform, right?
Yeah, and change that comment to be more definitive of OS platform. We don't.
Sorry, which one?
Comment number 4 over there.
So which one do you want? What's platform?
OS platform is the name we chose for the struct, not OS family. Just
We decide on the constructor.
What's it called? I think we did decide
Yeah,
that
we were going to
wanted
remove the constructor of a factory method.
What's it called? Create or get?
What does that bias exactly?
The thing that it buys us is that it pushes people towards using the static properties instead of seeing the constructor going new OS name. Now what do I pass into the string?
Yeah, sure. It might be like way too late for the discussion, but why wouldn't we make it a class and just force people to use like the static accessors?
I think we were trying to be efficient here because we just had a string. Right?
Yeah, but if you could never construct it yourself, why not just?
Well, we could.
Because you can always pass null and screw people.
Well, you can default
Same
construct this
here.
thing and screw yourself.
This thing's pretty much has a null.
null and default constructor.
Oh, but we can decide that they're like the only place where you can observe what they are is like, we can make them behave the same as.
Yeah, you can always treat this
empty
an empty string.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
So I guess
you
you're-
still have to have one that's none of the above because for the default initialized case.
I guess you're just trading, like, by making it a class, like, you're just trading the, like, well, now you definitely can't construct it, but you can pass it null, right? So,
You're just increasing.
Right.
and when you do construct it, now you're paying another object allocation, which, like,
I think
So
the
it's not
reason
even
why.
object allocation, you're paying indirection cost, it's
Right.
swinging,
Sure,
you're putting, crap
Right.
image into heap, like.
Exactly. Like this thing is basically
It's just a
once it
number.
gets code gens, it's gonna be a string and no overhead. If you make it, the question is like, why would I think we just don't feel like we need to add any overhead to that string.
So in like the color struct, I think they do a similar pattern, and their factory methods are called like from ARGB.
So it could be
like from OS platform.
or something like that.
Yeah, but I don't.
Create is okay.
Create seems fine.
So what do we allow you to pass into the constructor or factory method or whatever?
A
Like,
string.
does it have to be?
Any
Yeah,
string.
but what actually works? Does it have to be
Everything
normalized?
works. I imagine everything works.
Yeah, it's a matter of whether or not your platform supports that
Everything
string.
works, but this thing will always return false if it's not one of
Right.
those.
Yeah.
This,
so the idea is that when new platforms come out, people are going to have to declare, some well-known name. The BSD folks would say, oh, we're going to support capital B, capital S, capital D. That's going to be this string.
So like, but
Until we
But then
add-
they would have a static accessor.
Until we add the static thing, until the contract gets updated, this is like
but let me have to
the.
understand like how you would use that though, because I mean you would expect these same folks who bring up a new platform to actually implement his OS platform return true.
Otherwise, the code has.
Yeah, no, they would do that as well. Yes.
Yeah, but why couldn't they just then add the field at the same time?
because they don't distribute the reference assemblies that people build the.
But it's not a reference assembly. Like this is going to be implementation.
No, so their implementation they can just update.
But they-
right? But the point is that like if I write a portable library and then they make it so that my portable library works on FreeBSD, they don't have a way to give my portable library only
Is this implemented by the runtime as opposed to the NuGet package that ships or something? Like how are they going to have a separate implementation while using the same APIs that are from our NuGet package?
There's a good chance that they're
Implementation
not.
conversion, like you can run against a newer version of the implementation than the contract you ran against, right? So you compile against a contract that doesn't have this thing. So you do new or platform create BSD at runtime, you get a newer version
right.
that has an implementation.
Right.
of-
Yeah, I'm wondering how you'll get that newer version. Since
You'll
it's
be
the NuGet
running
package
on
that we
that.
ship.
Somebody's fork is probably not going to actually be in the
If you're-
NuGet package, the official NuGet
The
package
thing is, your
for
code
some
will
time.
look something like this, like if is BSD basically,
Yeah.
which will be only true in some future version, but otherwise your code still runs on the old version, which is what you want. Because you're like, if I'm on Windows, I work now, and then like I can light up on
if you
on
think about
BSD,
it,
right?
even though that there's not really a contract, it's just a single DLL, the contract is effective, the NuGet version you can declare dependency on. The only people that can update a new version is whoever owns the package. So if you build a new
But for people that actually want to run on BSD, then they'll like use a private feed with their own version of the package or something.
Or,
True, but that seems fragile, right? Because then.
So I'm saying that in the plan we have, they have to do that.
Yes,
like
but
to get
they'll
that to
pick an
return
existing
true.
version number, right? Which makes it a bit less of an issue, right?
But also, don't we? Anyways, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm sure there's a bunch there that.
Yeah. I think it's one of the scenarios that we haven't really thought through how that would actually work out in practice, but I think having that factory method is probably a good idea. I mean, other options, we just don't have it at this release. We can always add it later if we think we need it. But I mean, if your BSD guys are already using it, then probably should have to.
They haven't merged any code yet, but like it's going to be the first thing that we do, right? Like we're going to have to cross really soon.
All right.
So should there be any note about like following up with the DNX people to see like what?
I have it in the notes. I send the note. I have just because it doesn't really belong in that thing. This is mostly for the API shit. I upload both.
Did we record that we want to get rid of flags? Or we're not even doing
And
anything?
then there's no longer an Enum, right? Actually, I should probably add that comment.
This is the first time I've seen.
So to be clear, like when you type new OS name, it's still going to show up. You can't get rid of it.
When you say new OS name, but you won't be able to pass any arguments.
Yeah,
You won't be able to pass any arguments, so you won't be like, I think this is what I want. Because you'll be like, I really need to tell it which one. Whereas where you see string, you're like, oh, now I better hit the Stack Overflow to figure out what string to pass in, because you might not.
Yeah,
Or
definitely.
you
I was
just type
kinda
in
responding
Linux,
to the note
right?
that says-
I mean, this is all like minor in my opinion, because you might, when you get stuck, you might, just hit F1 on the type or something and then see like, oh, Linux, that's what I want. Like, I don't think you'll get like, you hit F12, like, and you could probably figure out what,
It's
as
not
soon
that
as you,
complicated of a type.
but like, I'm fine with the factory, but I don't think it would have been disastrous, like, without it. Like,
Yeah, I agree. I think this just slightly nudges people the right way.
Right.
So the API is good. Now the last question I'll have is, what's the criteria for letting people add new OS platform names? What's kind of the thing that we want to do?
well,
So earlier in the meeting, someone had made a comment that was basically like, we would merge in changes to add new platforms, even if we weren't going to support those platforms. That made me a little nervous, but
so
Well, I mean,
it doesn't necessarily
it
make me
seems like
nervous.
yes, but we need to agree on what a platform is, right? So, no, we're probably not going to have the multiple FreeBSDs, but
we could,
Raspberry
right?
Pi, sure, right?
Well, I would actually say we would
Or
be
maybe
more
that's
likely to
something
have
else, or that's a Linux, right?
Before we had a Raspberry Pi,
So
right?
we don't have a very, so like, it doesn't make me all that, so first of all, I wonder how many of these we'll get and before, but it doesn't have the same, it doesn't have a huge consequence, right? Because we already said we might have things like POSIX and Linux, so like they're allowed to overlap, so that gives us the range of flexibility. It's an arbitrary string, and like the only consequence is like there's more to pick from, and they aren't the ones that I want. It's not great, but it won't break anything. Like
Maybe we force
take
people
some, right?
to use the crate method for a trial period. Like, yes, if your platform starts to get used and needs a first class thing, then that's when we accept.
So
request for this.
there is an open issue right now in CoreFX from the BSD folks about the design for OS name or whatever when we do it for BSD. And so I think instead of like trying to think through in this meeting all of the different cases we could run into, like let's just use that as an example, work through them things, probably have a trial period, because there are good questions about, is it BSD, is it FreeBSD, and you have one for OpenBSD or whatever. And then we can kind of try to establish some guidance from there.
Yeah, because it's not only about adding the static property, it's also implementation somehow needs to.
Somebody has to implement whatever that new platform is.
Yeah, exactly.
Right now, the proposed implementation for this is separate build for each value here.
Correct, but it needs to be in the same NuGet package, correct?
Great.
Right. This is so. There's a scale. There might be some.
NuGet package, it's us. And
So hang on. Garmin.
Technically, that's not true, right? With lineups,
There's some NuGet v3 features
because they can change the implementation based on extrinsic state. But I mean, that's something we should probably think through too in this whole exercise. I actually like the idea of using the BSD one to actually run with that and see, because there's some other end-to-end that I'm not sure how that would work. But
Does NuGet v3 actually have a hard-coded list of like OS things that it supports in its lineups?
no, I think as far as NuGet is concerned, they have this thing called a runtime thingy, which is basically an arbitrary string that constructs. and that basically maps things arbitrarily. So as far as NuGet is concerned, it's just a string.
So whoever's basically defining what that platform means for BSD or FreeBSD, that kind of helps equate to exactly.
I believe that's true, but I would have to talk to Eric how that actually is playing out.
They wanted to call it runtime environment, but it was taken and then the runtime information, and then they chose runtime thingy.
Yeah, runtime thingy might be okay for this thing too.
I don't think they call it anything. I think in the actual JSON file, it may be just runtime. But I think the official name is like runtime ID with. I think that's what they.
Runtime ID we didn't consider yet.
So Red is asking, I assume that goes without saying that you're going to make this library work on Mono too, right? I assume that would be.
So it should just, like, the implementation right now is it's just MSIL, right?
Yeah,
like,
so they could just use that.
The problem is right now, right? Like, we don't ship it in a NuGet package with all the different versions. Like, but once that stuff is all hammered out, it should just work on it.
Yep, I would think that's true. All right, is there anything more we need to cover? Otherwise, I really think we should wrap it up. Because we spent it very, like, if you just look at the comments, it's not the worst one we had, but it's
Do you want to give a shout out to what this tool is? Because someone asked.
Yeah, so people are asking what this tool is. So it's an internal tool that we developed
a while ago. We're quite happy users of that. We're running through the whole period of like trying to get some of our stuff out in the open as well. This one is on our list, but I haven't really got the time to do that yet. But I'm aware it's useful. We use it all the time, so maybe eventually. If more people ask for it, it may help. Yeah, you can just tweet at the .NET account or myself. That's pretty much all I have. Anything else? Any more questions, concerns, wishes?
Ship it.
All right, and thanks for the room. And yeah, this one goes out on YouTube. So in case you wonder whether it's recorded, it's yeah, it should, like when I close the call, it should be 10 minutes later on YouTube. All right, bye guys.